Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me today is my good friend Azriel. Well, hopefully I can call you my good friend. I've known you for many years and you've been working on a lot of really interesting research. And today is an ideal time to introduce that research because today is the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which only happens once every 800 years. According to some prophecies, a world teacher will be revealed today because this is also known as the Bethlehem star, and some think it's associated with the star that guided the three wise men or magi to Jesus. So who knows? Maybe Azriel is the world teacher, maybe someone else is. But regardless, this is a momentous day on multiple fronts. So before we get started, make sure you follow and subscribe to the Roundtable Podcast on YouTube and BitChute and Podbean. We have over 220 episodes now. But most of all, join the Roundtable Discord server where we record the podcast every day at 8 p.m. Central, and where you can find all our podcasts and links to all of our social media and web stores, etc. So, that being said, thank you so much for joining me, Mr. Azriel. Pleasure to have you. I'm glad that you have decided to release this information. And how are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing today?
Good. Sorry, I know I'm a little bit long-winded right now. But we're going to go through this, right? So you and I have known each other for a while, and you have a pretty broad range of research and interests. I know you research the Bible and history and theology and esotericism and many other things. So I understand that you have compiled some of your research into a documentary, which you are prepared to release soon, and the name of which I think is Aquarian Blueprint. Is that much correct?
Correct, yeah. Essentially, it's just intentionally, it didn't start out this way. It was just sort of I was kind of a hobbyist with researching conspiracies on my free time. And from some personal experiences, I had, in a roundabout way, come full circle with some of my childhood upbringing. So, mainly getting back in touch with my upbringing in scriptures. In the West, we refer to that as the Bible. But essentially, I just kind of didn't really pay much mind to these things for years, and went off, just doing things per the way of the world, career, family, and stuff like that. And then when I got out of my 20s and started getting into my 30s, I had a lot more free time. And when I started going to business for myself, I had a lot more time. And just a lot of things, more reading and whatnot, a lot of things didn't add up. And so, I really the only way to figure out some of these questions I had involving theories I had, and then also some of the conspiracies that I had come across in my research that weren't left to question. I began to see connections, and not really having any comrades or any partners or collaborators to help me work with this. Being as that my research was so unique with some of the oddball angles I was coming at this with, I had to take it upon myself to learn a lot of these studies, liberal arts and sciences from the ground up. And of course, the more I got into these things, the more the more I began to feel that they had essentially an arbitrary nature. And as I dug deeper, I began to see that the things that seemed to be more fantastical to me became real, and the things that I was told to accept as real became more mythic. And what I'm referring to, of course, is just a lot of the standard narratives regarding origins of mankind. Now, a lot of them people are, not unfamiliar with. They have a lot of debates between theologians and secular thought, but more or less what I'm referring to are the lesser things that are involved with those larger narratives in the greater set of history, but that are overlooked. Like, for example, dating, chronology, and things of that nature, and how compartmentalized studies these networked um, details that are part of a larger body of history can be overlooked as individual pieces. But as you begin to connect them, which I mean, call it luck or just divine inspiration, sort of nudging. I began to sort of see that essentially everything did sort of begin to connect into this vertically integrated system, wherein it was as it was as cliched as the standard conspiracy symbol, the one of the most iconic, the whole pyramid and whatnot. But along the way, there was sort of an unexpected turn when I had been researching some of more or less popular conspiracies, like the Manson murders and whatnot, and I began to see connections with certain astronomical dates with these events that pertain to more or less occult activity. And I should probably give you a background too. Originally, I mean, I've had a lot of different professions in my life, but I originally wanted to actually go into investigating satanic ritual abuse, and I wanted to actually get into the program, and I wasn't really sure which intelligence community I wanted to work with, but essentially I dropped out when I was already involved in sort of like getting with through all the political side and everything to put myself at a higher rank initially, and essentially that was around the same time that I started leaning more into the well, I mean, I guess I could say I got more passionate about it because myself, I was born in '82, so when I graduated, this was shortly before 9/11. So in college during that same year, when 9/11 happened, of course, it kind of, for me, it kind of like changed my whole direction in terms of my interests in life, because my hobby began to become essentially like my main identity. Not particularly 9/11, but just that instance sort of raised an eyebrow and opened a larger door to a greater set of conspiracies, which ironically is actually kind of central to my research now in terms of how the past relates to the current, especially in the West, where I live here in the USA. But that aside, I can sort of give you a gestalt of what the Aquarian Blueprint is. It's essentially just something I coined, and it relates to a lot of the occult affiliations with what is known as a great year. And the great year is essentially the culmination of this Gnostic pantheistic theology, wherein the culmination of all of their efforts to obtain this self-fulfilling prophecy, being is that it's pantheistic, is according to a set of Kabbalistic numerology, some might call it gematria, and essentially they fixed it to a certain set of horoscopic astrological projections that basically attuned to the year 2020 and 2050. They sort of span. They sort of like there's debates on the exact number, and as you'll find when we go into the series deeper, that a lot of the numbers associated, whether it be astronomy or astrology, are arbitrary in general in terms of how they apply to the characterization, whether it's the occult or whether it's mainstream, looking from the outside in. But the Aquarian Blueprint is essentially a religious conspiracy concealed within a scientific dictatorship, in line with an astrological cosmology per a Gnostic theology, and it's socially integrated via technology. So, all of the post 2020 and on cybernetics, so the Internet of Things and the Fourth Industrial Revolution and whatnot. So, all of this tech is essentially purposed for basically sort of it's utilized as a technological platform which is presumed to endow them with the ability to achieve a pantheistic apotheosis. So the way that it's applied, obviously, is this is a theological concept that is wished to be realized. So it's you could force it, but essentially coercion is more of their preferred method. And in the modern day, they essentially take the Gnostic game theory, um, uh, characteristics that are indicative of indicative of Gnosticism, and they transcend that into sort of a modern day of thinking via the intelligence community through a system of trafficking information known as information warfare. And specifically, there's a branch of information warfare referred to as mind war that you'll find this interesting too. It's actually authored by Michael Aquino, who this is the same Michael Aquino that was the protege of Anton LaVey, former Church of Satan, and I believe the Setian branch of the Temple of Set. Not sure if he's still affiliated there, but he is the co-author of a published paper known as Mind War with another man named Paul E. Vallely, and he's also he's a general, and he is essentially a Rosicrucian Christian, if you want to be general, and they both co-authored what is essentially a new stage, advancements in information warfare, and this is essentially the whole goal is to have what is known as full spectrum dominance be applied to fix a particular narrative. And essentially, anyone could argue that this is all political, except for the fact that the military is basically just muscle to whoever's in charge. And the military, within the psychological operations division that hosts these methods and techniques, essentially they yield to a military doctrine. And the military doctrine, in a roundabout way, is greased by the hierarchy that is above the military, which in this case is beyond the political exoteric into the religious esoteric. So, these are your secret societies, your iconic roundtable groups within what could be referred to in a larger sense, the Illuminati, not specifically the Bavarian flavor in particular, but just in the sense of the way the many occultists like Manly P. Hall and others would refer to a general initiate as essentially someone who's seeking to gain enlightenment or to be illuminated, and essentially they're referred to collectively as Illuminati, because essentially the Illuminati, in a general sense, for which Freemasons also represent the free and accepted Masons, essentially all these associations with temple and building have to do with this larger, greater work, because essentially it is allegorical for what is essentially a pantheistic inversion of the Torah, for which a lot of the occultists believe is their secret doctrine. You have a lot of people like Blavatsky and others who have been pretty blatant about that in their books. I believe Isis Unveiled, I believe that's the book in particular, she actually goes into detail about how essentially the oral tradition is found within the scriptures that was later collated and Romanized as the Bible. But essentially they depending on how you want to classify the characterization of the peoples, the mainstay is that there are two narratives throughout history. There's a thesis, which is the original story, I guess, the original narrative on the origins of the universe and mankind, and that was the classic narrative. And then there was essentially a separation between two of the within the family, and then you established, two larger areas. One more of a smaller remnant, fluctuating within the larger dominant. Never really an actual state or nation or opposing force, but just sort of the remnant original, where the breakaway became the dominant civilization, which essentially established the string of what in the West would be referred to collectively as like the pagan societies. And during captivity, when a lot of the known Kabbalist religions were developed, these religions were essentially the product of mixing what was essentially a lot of the star-based. I mean, they're not particularly star-based, but essentially what it was is that the pagan religions having been an established breakaway in culture, was the essential founding of the general notions of trying to pursue an idea or to establish some sort of a theology by assessing the environment around them, the creation around them, and sort of decoding things that way. And in a general sense, you could call this mysticism or Gnosticism. There's a variety of words you could use to describe it, but essentially someone is trying to interpret a purpose within the design around them. And essentially, the classic belief was that there was, a creator for this, but then there was essentially a difference in opinion. These two opinions later got mixed, wherein essentially the latter then assumed the former. So if you wanted to call the original the thesis and the latter the antithesis was then sort of flipped in terms of totems, where the antithesis then interpreted the meaning within the thesis, and the two combined then became essentially the Kabbalist religion. And this is where you have the interpretation of the messianic title in the Torah in the occult world being assumed as this, this pantheistic realization, which you could affiliate generally as gnosis, with this impending epoch that essentially is a culmination of a cosmic evolution of the world. And so the Aquarian Blueprint to them is associated with, like you said in the beginning of the recording, the great teacher who's supposed to appear and then essentially show them how this is supposed to work. And that's sort of the general tenor of their conspiracy. The issue is they have actually tried this once before. So essentially, they've always assumed that the Aquarian Age would be that year in an astrological sense. And when it became close to the age that they believed this would happen, would have originally been affiliated somewhere near the.
Hey, so Azriel, you dropped out on my end. Can anybody else hear me?
I can hear you, Shogun, but I don't hear him.
Yeah, Azriel, you dropped out. If you want to leave, we can come back, or you there?
Good.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay,
Go ahead.
cool. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know where you want to go from there. That's just sort of just the rough general
Yeah.
tenor
No,
of it.
that's a very good introduction, and that's a lot of information. In order to structure the event, the podcast rather, I thought I'd walk through what you laid out. So you said origin of today's Illuminati conspiracy. So obviously you believe that the conspiracy at work is Illuminati. So tell us about the origin of that. Where did it start? And how has it developed to where we are now?
Now, you wanted to know the Illuminati in a general set, or the actually the
Well, so
mystery school,
I'm following the
the
timeline, so to
announcement.
speak, that you gave us, right? So number one
Right.
was origin of today's Illuminati conspiracy. So obviously there is an Illuminati conspiracy, and you were going to tell us about the origin or where it started. So
Yeah,
if you
essentially the tip or the platform for all of this, um, without going into detail with numbers and whatnot, um, the origin of today's what is now classified as the Illuminati conspiracy is sort of bridged from events that took place with what we would assume with our traditional education as the time of Rome. So typically, if you were to stack um, some of the more iconic religious history on with any of the history would that even a secularist would agree exist per their traditional education, people would be affiliating basically the Bible, fitting it in the New Testament era. So when you and this is some really deep stuff, but essentially, if you lift the veil and the arbitrary context of what is essentially revisionist history, you find that there was a point in time during the Middle Ages, essentially during the Enlightenment, Renaissance, where a remainder system was installed, which is what you have now, your 4-digit years, and the remainders, the histories of Greek and Roman classic histories were sort of stylized by a few academics who had sway over, I guess, what was instituted as being affirmed as mainstream history. And there are various systems and adjustments and alterations that were made that essentially affected how history read. And a lot of this has not been corrected, regardless if the individual sciences have changed or altered. Because, like I said, a lot of this is compartmentalized, and it's just not compared in a larger aspect of comparative studies. Because, as far as I know, I'm not aware of any classes and any sorts of schools that compare the entire general set of knowledge to that degree. Um, I mean, I had to really pull to grab some of this stuff, and a lot of it I couldn't find at the universities. So, but essentially, though, the the torch being passed from the old world to the new world is sort of the biggest focus on. Obviously, that's the larger question that a lot of people have, is the how it transcended. So, a lot of people argue whether these conspiracies even exist, and a lot of it has to do with the modern concept of history, and to sort of summarize it, uh, essentially what took place is there was a rewriting of history where a parody of ancient history was dual dated and then thrown into a remainder system that created a differential in the way that the time was expressed. And this has a lot to do with the shifting of different calendar systems and the changing between astrology that was focused more on ecliptic cycles, and then going into astronomy, where it, as it pertains to a lot of the interactions within our immediate solar system, you have a differential between interstellar and interplanetary, and so you actually have a lot of issues with a sort of essentially translating this information, and that those mistranslations have affected the understanding of a lot of these histories that are assumed as just common, and there's nothing conspiratorial about them, except when you actually look into this, and then you start to notice things that exist, like if I can remember the name of it, it's like there's transcendental rules and certain things like this that affect the translation of astrology to astronomy, in terms of mathematics, because this wouldn't matter in terms of what an astronomer may think about what an astrologer thinks, but given the fact that they had to transcend a lot of the older accounts of history based on seasonal accounts, and those records were, of course, measured by different methods and installed into different systems of accounting, especially after calendarizing. And then, of course, when you finally get into the medieval ages around the 1500s, then you start having things like periodization within what they officially call chronology, in terms of this. Sometimes they refer to it as Scaligerine chronology, but this is, of course, not the only individual that was affiliated with making these alterations. But essentially, the reason that this was done is not by coincidence. In some instances, there are a lot of cases where within the circles of academia, they're unaware of this. That, you know, any quote unquote expert in their profession could be wrong or misled, regardless of how many years they have under their belt. So there are actually a lot of innocent mistakes, but these innocent mistakes are platformed off of an actual larger conspiracy that essentially has been the hallmark of what most people in the general conspiracy circles sort of lean towards, which is there is a larger esoteric cabal that sort of reigns over this microcosmic political structure, and this is sort of a worldwide thing. And many people believe that this has existed since the beginning of civilization, and that it's just quietly kept its life going in the shadows. And essentially, that's true. And the way that this happened is what was known in the mystery, or in the ancient world, as a larger collective they referred to as the mystery schools, rewrote itself into history as academia, and through affiliations with certain known groups like the Royal Society, the mystery schools sort of niched themselves in through a series of mercantilism and whatnot. And then, I mean, most people are familiar with the Napoleonic Wars and how a lot of the current families that are affiliated with the Illuminati sort of worked their way in through sort of seizing the stocks in during the times of the Napoleonic Wars. So that aside, it was essentially just the passing of the torch of the old world to the new world, where the mystery school masqueraded as academia and created essentially a parody of itself without losing its Gnostic theology. They basically created a hermetic base via science, and then maintained their old ways through the esoteric, affirming of what you see in like the OTO or a lot of the Freemasonic societies, where they emphasize the ancient world, but then they communicate this in all of their works into this theosophic work where it's sort of a mixture of the Hermetic and the Gnostic, which again is actually part of their Gnostic theology. Because, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of people argue what Gnosticism is, but when you understand that these religions can essentially be split between two main narratives, and we'll go into that, in future recordings, but it essentially their theology plays off of game theory and takes the iconic struggle between good and evil and uses it in this two-pillar system where you essentially create a royal arc, which is a vertically integrated system that essentially creates a centralized emphasis. And so in this case, it's relative not just of the game theory and sense of Gnosticism, but the point to it, which is to create, which is to triangulate and create this vertically integrated structure so that it points towards the apex, which in this case represents the culmination of their work, the great work, the apotheosis, the transcendence, the ascension, the gnosis, essentially realizing yourself as God, the goal of pantheism. Now, at the same time, pantheists also believe they are God, but this is also because this is dualistic in the sense that the as above and so below assumes that basically creation was unfolded by a if you want to be really crude about it, but not distasteful, essentially a decomposed God became the manifestation of what we know as creation, and then essentially made this, and there's been this series, this process of a cycle of reincarnation, and it's according to a certain series of ages, cosmic ages, wherein it will continue until there's a process of reaching this goal of getting to this, this ascended state. And according to their theology, they haven't got there yet. And this also correlates to the crux of their conspiracy, which is that originally around the time that would have been estimated that Jesus would have showed up during what they would have called Rome, the second Temple era Kabbalists would have assumed that would have reflected essentially what they thought would have been the culmination of their great work. Because remember, they were reading a pantheistic inversion through the Torah, so all of their dispensations were according to horoscopes or prophecies that were based off of their mixture of astrology and a lot of other mystic teachings, with using the Torah as the anchor of essentially the direction of these dispensations that were indicative of their interpretation of their revision, the replacement theology. And then they inserted this within the biblical narrative, if you will, and then interpreted, and then drew out their understanding from it. So essentially, the way that this is recorded with that affiliated history, they disagreed, and apparently still today, the Kabbalists and the larger Jewish population, you may have some that may, but essentially the standard of the religion still states that they don't recognize Christ as, well, specifically, if I want to be specific, not to muddle, but they don't acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. So obviously that still stands true. And when their assumption that this would be the time of the great teacher, and this teacher did not come and explain to them what they had wished. Of course, as we, anyone who's read the New Testament, they know that there was a dispute because of this. Jesus was telling them that your ways were wrong, you're misunderstanding. They wanted to keep their traditions, and of course, they've kept on to that. And then now, of course, you still see the same thing, where essentially Kabbalism and Gnosticism, pantheism, from east to west across the globe, you can use essentially any one of their characterizations, and they all lead to the same thing. We can take the cosmic egg, for example. In a roundabout way, you can reduce it to a child's fairy tale, Humpty Dumpty. So, if you really consider Humpty Dumpty as essentially a very simple way of telling the pantheistic theology that is involved within, or that is that correlates to the cosmic egg. So, this is an astrological illusion in terms of Gnostic cosmology as it relates to pantheism, and the yoke within would represent the sun, the outer shell would represent the boundaries, and so you have these as above so principles where Humpty falls off the wall being the ecliptic line with the zodiac, and then down to earth, the king's horses and king's men, or essentially the manifest destiny royals that can't put him back together again. And I mean these are silly, but essentially these metaphors serve for to be pretty useful in terms of describing it to someone who has a hard time understanding, who hasn't walked the walk, to have done all of this research. But essentially that's what they believe, and because of the fact that a lot of this created a lot of dispute within the Roman government. Now I should say that Rome and Greece, there are some interesting things that we'll have to get into. I don't want to open that can of worms tonight, because that'll stray us off course. But for now, I'll refer to it at least in sort of a semi-mainstream and then semi-theoretical context, without unveiling everything completely too quickly. But essentially, what was done is the old world and the mystery schools that still wanted to stay in power, but were having a hard time, obviously, now with the unexpected turn of populism that would have, been arisen from what, the common person in the West would refer to as like a Christian uprising. I wouldn't classify it that way myself. Later, sure, but in an actual true sense, I wouldn't characterize it that way. But that's neither here nor there at the moment. But essentially, they co-opted that, the same as the Babylonians or others co-opted and essentially assimilated. And in this case, you have what ended up becoming the later on the Christian establishment, the Catholic Church, first and second century churches, and all the denominations that followed. And then through those, they essentially co-opted the populism and then reconsolidated their religion through the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this is no news to most people. Most people are familiar with all of this. But, of course, what they may not be familiar with is the fact that in order to sort of extend themselves a grant on their theological pursuits, because, of course, being pantheists, they just essentially believe that we must have done something wrong, or we have to have a do-over, or this is just not the right time, or our calculations are off. I mean, like, they're committed. Essentially, they're basing this off knowledge, so they would, thereby assume they're not doing it well enough. But at the same time, to be able to maintain this and still platform themselves, they essentially bought themselves some time by having the Caesars in the Roman government permanently fix the cardinal signs to Aquarius, by dialing it back into Pisces to extend them another astrological age, so they could then claim that the dispensation would be timed as proof positive uh, of their ascended master coming, right? And then in class, to the typical Christian in the West, they would assume of that as being the, covert 1,000 years Antichrist dark reign, posing as a benevolent, Christian uprising. But like I said, I wouldn't characterize it that way, but just for the sake of speaking to the majority of people's common language for tonight, I'll just refer to it as that. But yeah, essentially, they created through the first and second century churches, they created a revolving door for themselves, and then, according to their Gnostic doctrine, they set up the Christian religion and any opposing pagan rivalries as dummies to knock over, and then transcend into the royal arc into science. But of course, this is a linear ploy that is, being operated from like a multi-dimensional position. And so, even though it appears that science transcended out of society, sort of becoming enlightened post-Dark Ages after getting over all of its, like the ebb and flow between good and evil, and that being essentially framed as being the culprit for the downfall of society, they were trying to, reinvent themselves. And the mystery school, transcended into academia, and then through the royal societies and their affiliations that they had with the government, they sort of just synergized and then carried themselves, like I said, by creating these arbitrary sciences, which then bolstered a lot of the adjustments that they made to the dating, and then they covered their tracks with these sciences. Essentially, that's the simple way of explaining it. And so this is all set up, and also this is the reason why everything is scripted, as you can see with the majority of conspiracies. It's because, according to a pantheistic doctrine, they believe that this is something that they have to do according to a sort of like these sociopathic rituals, but they believe that there's a divine payoff to it, and their interpretation of the world is a lot different than most people would believe. They actually, being is that they utilize the sciences essentially as a open door policy to execute their Gnostic endeavors covertly. And this, a lot of people might write that off as BS, but I mean, if you look at the founding of some of the main direction that they're aiming the arrow of science at, you have computer science, you have space technology, space age technology, and whether it be space age or the information age, the majority of these computers were massively influenced by religious inspirations, especially the original space program, as it's heavily concerned with jet propulsion laboratories. And a man who some people are familiar with, but surprisingly enough, a lot of people are not. Jack Whiteside Parsons. He's essentially the granddaddy of JPL, and he was buddies with Aleister Crowley, and basically a member within the OTO, and essentially platformed along with a lot of with the German scientists that came over from Operation Paperclip. They sort of synergized, given that the war was fake. I can go to that later too. It was not fake in terms of that it was, fake in a complete sense, but the war narrative was fake, and it was essentially a proxy war, which is to say that it was a real war for ulterior motives that were not conveyed to the public who was involved with the war, or who was at war. And uh, Jack Parsons was, like I said, if you wanted to generalize, most people in the West would label him essentially as a Satanist. It's a little more detailed than that. I would just throw him in there as a mystic. But essentially, yeah, I mean, he was because he was a member of the OTO, he still was involved with all of the ancient mystery school religions, just like Crowley and all of the other, mainliner occultists that people are aware of today were. And of course, this is also why he ended up getting involved in a project known as Babylon Working, which essentially was involved with sort of ushering in the culture into a shift, which of course you can then later on connect to a lot of the MK Ultra series of projects, whether you go into Subproject 58 or whether you go into connections with the Summer of '69. You can go to Manson, Zodiac, Berkowitz, and of course '69 also being the Apollo space mission. You've also got Kennedy that works in there. Kennedy also was also assassinated after his election, during the passing of a conjunction. And then there was also, of course, an alignment with Mars in '69 as well. So the point being to all of this is that this essentially bases around more of the iconic Mesopotamian mystery school religions, wherein they emphasize Mars as being the hermetic body of the spiritual sun. And of course, they believe that the cycles that take place between the interstellar and interplanetary are indicative of essentially their ascended master's consciousness from the Kabbalistic Ein Sof that transcends down and projected through the stars, manifest into man until the reincarnate spirit, according to their Assyrian life, death, rebirth cycle, brings forth the ascended master that teaches them how to achieve this cosmic evolution. And so essentially the space program was designed to platform all of this. And this is why when you into the advanced sciences at what I would call the hyper level, it really starts to blur into metaphysics, where essentially whether you're talking about things like subatomic particles or quantum mechanics, you're essentially talking about the same sort of micro and macro principles that Gnostic theology or that the mystics entertain. And of course, like I said, this is because it's not coincidental. Because if you wanted to be, if you really wanted to get down to it, the word itself, science, in a general sense, just means knowledge. But in terms of its method, its method derives out of the Hellenistic styled school of thought, which of course was borrowed from the Mesopotamian, which is and this is the mainstream association. And so when you really give this a full analyzation, Eastern philosophy, or I'm sorry, Western philosophy is actually just a parody of Eastern philosophy. And so what is portrayed as everything that is Western is actually just the installment of Eastern philosophy in the Western territories. And it just so happens that the timing of all of this takes place when when this conspiracy was at its turn. And of course, as it comes to be towards the year now, 2020, we're approaching where, according to what was done with the Romans when they had made these alterations to the calendar and the dating systems that then trickled down over to us today, of course, the year was changed from being in March around the 21st, that was according to the Babylonian year, to the Roman installed year in January, which was obviously the difference between the spring and summer versus the fall and winter, solstice. And the relationship between 2020 and their ancient theology is this is supposed to be the carryover of the next like I guess the culmination. I can't exactly date it specifically. I'm actually still working on some of the logistics for this because it's a lot to condense. That's sort of the most difficult part, is condensing this and then explaining it to an audience that's going to satisfy all of the masses, because everyone's going to have their weak points in terms of this information. I want to try to make it sort of hit a broader audience instead of just sort of staying up in maybe just sort of the niche interest or like the academic interest per se. But essentially, this is the carryover into like their 1,000-year Reich or whatever. It's mentioned all over. Hitler was involved in the same thing. Which, by the way, I might kind of go into that real quick. When I mentioned proxy war earlier, if you've ever read a lot of Albert Pike's work and other occultists, you hear them making affiliations with wars in the future and whatnot. And of course, Albert Pike outlining these 3 world wars, which I've heard the counter debates claiming that the mentions to Manzini were actually fake, but I'll make sure to dig up my notes for next time. I looked pretty deep into this, and it turns out that it's actually more likely than it is unlikely that Pike had actually made those communications, and that there was a lot of knowledge about it, but through a series of publications about it, and then having ghostwriters make parodies of that, and then hoaxes related to it, it sort of got lost in the shuffle of coincidences and conspiracies. That being said, Crowley already having a relationship with what became the legacy through Parsons, also there was a strong affiliation with Hitler and Mussolini, because Crowley was actually contracted to go initiate Mussolini and Hitler into essentially like basically touching base. And of course, this is why shortly after Hitler instituted his national policies, why he made a quick 180 and started going and looking for like angel archetypes and carrying around an interest with the Nag Hammadi and things of this nature, and like Eastern philosophy and things of that nature. So Crowley, he's not like the guy behind the guy behind the guy, so to speak. He was just one of the more or less popular shock jocks that the Mystery School had go out there as sort of their PR provocateur and sort of set up a lot of these. And I mean, he was a depraved man, but I wouldn't call him stupid by any means. Naive in a spiritual sense, sure, but logically and tactically, he was a dangerous man, and he inspired a lot of wrong, particularly through Parsons, because a lot of the affiliations through Parsons and the space program has a lot to do with why the modern-day military-industrial complex has so much technological sway today. And this actually has a lot to do with Parsons' relationship with the carryover from space age technology into the information age technology, where satellites, communications, and whatnot are concerned. Now, of course, that I've given a sort of a background of in a general set of Crowley's affiliation with Jack Parsons, I wanted to sort of go into a little more detail about what was referred to as Babylon working. And essentially, if you're familiar with Crowley's work, Crowley was into a particular brand of occultism that he referred to as sex magic. And the sex magic was, there was a Hermetic base to it, sure, but there was a Gnostic inspiration. So there was always the male counterpart and the polarity of trying to battle with the female counterpart in reference to an alchemical marriage, which of course is just an illusion for uh, the cosmic evolution according to an epoch or a dispensation. And so Crowley's sex magic was extended and inspired Jack Parsons to essentially align the timing astronomical the astronomical timing of the Apollo space mission to be when Mars was in alignment with the moon, to reference the sorry, not in alignment with the moon, but when Mars was an emphasis as a means to sort of emulate the planetary metaphor for what I mentioned earlier about Mars being the hermetic body of the ascended master archetype that has these angelic qualities, because it's essentially affiliated through cosmology, because as I also mentioned earlier, where magic is concerned with the pantheistic theology, they believe that the magic is in creation because God is a part of creation, and therefore they can draw on the divinity in creation and whatnot. So Crowley was essentially trying to invoke a cultural shift by sort of, like I said, creating a series of self-fulfilling prophecies, which, Crowley was all about dominance. And he had inspired Jack Parsons to carry out a ritual. Now, I have theories that Jack Parsons was just young and in over his head. He was a smart and brilliant young man, but I think essentially that the mystery school played on his naivete, likely murdered him, which is consistent with their sociopathic ritualism. And they essentially used him to platform all of this, and then sort of just used him as a sacrificial lamb. But he was involved with a woman that he essentially believed that was the feminine embodiment in a spiritual sense, that she carried the spirit of Babylon. And so even though he had these physical rituals in a sense of sexual intercourse, this was just again just an inflection of the Hermetic below with the Gnostic above. And the main point was that they did believe that they were in contact with these forms of spiritual consciousness. And I'm not going into debate whether they were or were not, but from their perspective and what they have written about. I mean, you should read some of the stuff that Jack Parsons has put out there. Like it reads like a Shakespeare play. Like, and this is the guy that set up JPL, which basically helped get put NASA on the map in terms of how it's known today. So it's just funny how you see this affiliation with these Freemasonic Christians and these Satanists who are involved in sort of this struggle with one another, and they're both sort of like inching forth this Royal Ark system. So you have the same thing going on in World War II, where you have these strong Judeo-Christian rivalries against these essentially occult Nazis, which, political affiliations aside, this is just a Gnostic act that was according to what Albert Pike outlined, which was to essentially shift the balance of powers and essentially create these proxy wars through national tension racking, and then converge this into a set of internationalist model, or into an internationalist model, and then sort of fluctuate that through globalism, and then sort of having control of all of the societal institutions related to the infrastructure of a civilization. They were able to coerce the direction of society, and then essentially posit their theological archetype as being the spiritual embodiment of the modern man, the modern citizen, the modern woman, essentially directing and influencing the culture. And they set up a lot of this, uh, you know, in the 60s, and then of course you jump into the computer age, and then of course that sort of carries us, from where it really picked up in the 80s, and then on into now. And then this is where sort of the techniques of the mystery school, who was now academia, who is now intertwined, especially after the French Napoleonic Wars, as essentially running, Western Europe, and then essentially, running America by extension via the synthesized Western philosophy out of Eastern philosophy. And of course, that's why we have in America the feminine version, essentially, of all of the old school, more male emphasized religions, which is equivalent. I mean, it's dualistic and consistent with their religion. But the point is you can see that the placement in time is consistent with the emphasis of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy sort of being the older.
Yeah. So I want to make sure, because we do have a certain amount of time limit on what we can put onto BitChute and YouTube. So I want to make sure we get the core message tonight. So revisionist history and occult ritualism and the connection to the new normal.
Right, and that's... Go ahead, sorry.
No, that's all. So I don't know if we can cover both of these. Maybe we can. So revisionist.
Well, I was kind of going into the new normal. I was just, because, like I said, we can go deeper into it in other broadcasts if you want. But for tonight, I can just sort of kind of hurry it into through the information age, but then that would platform us into the current age, where we are now in 2020.
Absolutely, because we can. The great thing about Discord as a platform, our recording time is free. We don't pay for it, so we can do as many episodes as we want, and as long as there's content to be recorded, we would love to record it. So fantastic. But just how do you feel we should wrap it up for someone who's been listening to this episode, heard everything you have to say so far? What is the message you'd like them to, take away, or the knowledge?
Well, essentially, the new normal is, as most people have already figured out, it's code word essentially for, the new culture that would be associated with the New World Order, which is really just arbitrary, because the New World Order is the Old World Order. It's just they're coming out of the closet now and, lifting the veil, which again is consistent with what they believe Revelations is, according to their alteration and relocation of dispensations consistent with their revisionist replacement theology and history. So where we are today with the new normal, they're integrating their conspiracy essentially into the Fourth Industrial Revolution via cybernetics. And the reason that there's the timing of all of this with the COVID-19 and all else it directly correlates to everything that has happened and been emphasized since March, whether it's George Floyd and that obvious Hiram Abiff ritual, which of course March, around the time that a lot of this was like at its height. And there was things that were going on in April and May, obviously, and in June and July, even in the celestial sense. But in terms of a lot of the reasons why it was important during March, it has to do with the fact that this is the time that was the Babylonian New Year, and of course, per the transfer in Roman times when they had the alterations and essentially switched the beginning of the year to January, what you've seen from March and then coming towards January now in 2020 is their ritual essentially carrying over from east to west in accordance with the seasonal transfer of the winter solstice occurring now, whereas I mean, when it's winter on one side of the world, it's the opposing season on the other. So this is essentially them balancing it and having the ritualism catch up, but then being consistent in a linear, progressive sense according to mounting up to something. And essentially, the reason that they've timed all of this has to do with them wanting to set up the fourth industrial revolution in terms of their projection of what they have set around for 2045, 2050. And according to their astrological great age, they believe that there's supposed to be an event around 2050. And so they have the singularity set up for this. Now, remember, I'm not attesting to this in terms of saying that I believe this, but this is what they believe. And around 2045 and 50, the same time that they have these projections for a singularity and all of the cybernetic integration into the quantum and all of this, it literally lays on top of their projections in an astrological sense, with the culmination in an even greater sense of this. And so right now in 2020, and let me see if I can grab my note real quick, because this is actually sort of an important part here to not be wrong about. But I know everyone has seen a lot of the affiliations during the election in the U.S. with Biden and the number 33, and of course, the number 33 associated a lot in Freemasonry and the Illuminati, and there are multiple reasons why this is. I mean, you've got 33 columns, the whole Jacob's Ladder thing, and others. I won't go into that, but in terms of how it relates to what we're discussing right now, there's going to be a Saturn-Pluto cycle in 2020, and it will unfold a series of stages that will affect essentially the tenor of the world over the next 33 years. So according to their projections, from 2020 over the next 33 years is the shift, and that is, of course, takes you into the 2045, 50 range. So this is not coincidental. They've actually timed all of this per their astrological dispensations, essentially to try to make a point. And their whole idea is that they have the Gnostic theology, wherein they take this whole Hellenistic interpretation of the biblical narrative and then assume that, Satan is the god of this world, and that is a prison, and that there's essentially this Gnostic environment where heaven is this different cosmic realm outside of the visible light spectrum that you can't see. And generally, this is the same thing that scientists are talking about when they say the quantum. When we're talking about quantum, we're just going into micro and macro again. They got that idea from the theological concepts. No surprise based on what I told you about the transfer between the mystery school and academia. But essentially, they're trying to look for something beyond the veil, the fabric of the universe. And so the aim of science and the aim of Kabbalism, Gnosticism, Pantheism, the mystery school, Mysticism, they all converge in the exact same direction. And so all of the strange activity you've been seeing, which is between the fake news and the obvious conspiracies that throw in the election and all of that, this is all designed to platform this. Which, again, I should probably mention this too, because there's actually a very important event that relates to the election involving the Great Conjunction that has been it's been a common theme in their ritualism. And this involves what a lot of people mislabel as an Indian curse, a Native American curse, affiliated with the Skull and Bones Society. Now, I'm not going to go into that. The point is that that's not what dictates what I'm about to say. What dictates the alleged president's curse, which is to say, there's this conspiracy. There's this notion of conspiracy that amongst some spiritual hierarchy, that people within the Skull and Bone Society are cursed because of things that were done to in a distasteful sense to the remains of Native Americans, and this is like a curse. that's passed along. And the reality of it is that you actually see that there are instances where these instances predate that, and not just in America, but in other places as well, where essentially what you have is that it has nothing to do with the political inspirations tied to the occult in that myopic sense. What it actually is they're timing these events according to their ritualistic tendencies as it relates to horoscopic astrology. So every time there's a great conjunction, so far, what I've seen in history, it's not to say that, that a president will die, but there has been at least 7 out of 10 times from what I've looked in my research that a president is targeted for assassination, or there's some tragedy that unfolds amongst the administration. But this has happened with Kennedy, Lincoln, and Reagan and Bush. And even though, like I said, you don't have to die, it's the threat of death in a ritualistic sense which is important to them, and that's really all that matters, is the ritual itself. So in that sense, you have that aspect. And so I actually made a mention of this, which, it's kind of funny in the sense that I never thought, I assumed I would be right because I thought my projections were correct in terms of what I'd researched in my analysis. But, to see that I had made the correlation between this relationship with the timing of how policies are decided based on this esoteric spiritual hierarchy that sort of trickles down doctrine that then is applied in a form of method that appears secular but is actually quite religious. And so the conjunctions being affiliated with the presidential assassination is one aspect to this. But another one is the ritualism regarding the very same aspects of the winter solstice, which, by the way, as you notice, the inauguration that actually takes place on, I believe, January 21st, which, if I'm not mistaken, is when there is a lifting of a certain period of the conjunction, which I can assure you is no coincidence. And so
Okay, is there any possibility that you're just fucking with us and all this?
No,
shit
I am. Go look it up right now. No. I swear to you.
Like you're fucking with me right now.
I swear to you, if you go look it up right now, it's probably going to tell you that the inauguration is. I believe if I'm not wrong, it's like January 21st or something.
You may be right, but it just sounds a little bit like.
It sounds crazy, right? But okay, it sounds crazy, but not as crazy as having looked at this and then having people have come out with documents in June that was telling you that there was going to be an operation, that 9/11 would go down, or that in a larger sense during that same year, 8 months prior, when those leaks were out, there was something called Joint Vision 2020, which is essentially something that would be the carryout of the next stage of operation or information warfare, which later on you would see the consolidation of all the intelligence communities under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which then you can see how easily, via the Joint Chiefs of Staff, how through the military-industrial complex, you could easily square the Republican and Democrat parties under your thumb, and then trickle down narratives through the media via the military-industrial complex, and then, of course, have the spiritual hierarchy above that honcho, which is what you're seeing now. I mean, I live in California, and I'm not outing anyone in particular, but the way that the situation is set up is that both sides are played. And so you have left playing right, you have right playing left, and then you have Trump's character in the middle. But Trump is essentially being used as an archetypal link to the majority of society, where essentially anything that they do to Trump, they try to stitch to the public. And that's not to give an argument towards Trump, because the reality is that he's heavily knit into all these conspiracies. Not to say that he's guilty or anything, and not to say that he's not, but the reality is that I mean, if we had more time, I would love to go into detail and show you some of the stuff that I have on, what more or less of become familiar with now as gatekeepers in the fallacious truth movement, like your Alex Jones types. I mean, I have audio admissions of Alex Jones talking about being at IHOPs in his early 20s before he was involved with InfoWars or Genesis Broadcasting Network, and that he was there at basically makeshift Pentagon meetings at a Denny's, and that Trump was there, and that essentially that they were breaking out like long sticks with chalkboards and talking about these like what sounds like basically like the plan or like Q narratives where they're saying there's a satanic cabal and you have to do something, and he's implicating Trump. Essentially, the reason he was doing this is because he was in a coast to coast interview where he was explaining that he was admittedly part of a larger resistance patriot group inside the government that was working against the CIA, and that him and Trump were contracted as a part of this sort of like New America type like broadcasting like sting operation to create what he refers to as a new republic. But like here's where it starts getting deeper, right? When you look into it and you consider what I said, him saying that in the current state of affairs of the nation is ridiculous, because saying that the CIA is at war would simply be arbitrary, especially if you know their MO in terms of how they apply information warfare. They have tons of, I mean, look at the elections, right? You had the Waldorf IO that was at the Arizona hearing that said that that their information warfare, their IOs were essentially watching the election, and they were keeping an eye on this, and so obviously they had eyes on the whole time. And if they had eyes on that time, it's likely they had on eyes on before. And so what I'm saying here is that this is essentially just according to the same document that you had the two individuals I mentioned earlier, Michael Aquino and General Pauly Valley, that were pushing. And it's interesting that I mentioned General Valley because he's actually one of the insiders within the military that pushed a lot of the Q stuff on national television, on your mainstream televisions. Valley was one of the guys that pushed the whole Q thing, and of course, what is his role? He's a Rosicrucian, so he projects a Christian archetype, same as Alex Jones. So you can sort of see how what's going on here is that the Vision 2020 operation is in line with Albert Pike's. Now, I'm not saying that's like their main sting. I'm just saying that this is just like a variety of aspects relative to their multidimensional warfare construct. And essentially, the idea is to do the same thing that was done in World War II, and then similar to what they did in the 60s, which is to use a patsy that's involved in their larger esoteric construct, regardless of the fallacious national tension-racking campaigns that they have going on. And so, like what you see with the trade war in China, while you simultaneously see the conspiratorial insider trading via, Belt and Road or just Wall Street in general, the banks and all that, it's clearly just one big pyramid scheme in a club that you're not a part of. And what's going to happen over the next few years in terms of how this is going to be platformed and marketized is the same way that the space race was marketized, the same way that atomic energy was marketized, which of course work hand in hand in terms of how you see the linear progression of the technology's advancement. And so China is being set up, and I'm not saying China is good. I'm saying their intelligence works with our intelligence because, in a larger sense, the special interests that are above that network those two. And even if you look at the sort of the orders that fall on the desk of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I've read them myself. They talk about essentially how in what they call full spectrum dominance in information warfare, they have to coerce even their enemies and the public to become an unwitting agent, wherein they have a dog in the fight, and they get everyone to get involved in it for the purpose of essentially poisoning a narrative. But in terms of how China's involved, they want to prop China up as the enemy in terms of how we see it in a national sense, so that they can then use the excuses to sort of have this competition, which will then try to put America back on top with what they outline code word in their mind war projections as a new republic, which you'll hear Alex Jones mention this all the time on his show. And the new republic is essentially, like the iconic, like new age, like more postmodern version of like a Plato's New Republic, this utopian society, like this, like Shambhala, whatever you want to call it, like I said, their Third Reich, like their age according to like their occult dispensation. And so the whole, the whole aspect of turning China into this villain when they're playing along with all of this is a part of trying to platform a rivalry, and then by blaming this COVID virus on China, you can then sort of like create these tensions, have an excuse to sort of create like this seemingly legitimate conspiracy involving platforming essentially like this momentum that they're gaining by coercing the public into sort of hurrying along down this rabbit hole towards winter, and the specific affiliation with why they chose. I have sort of a tangent theory on this too. Why they focused in on the specific term corona is that they've had through MK Naomi and stuff over years a fixation on a lot of plandemics being affiliated with the if I'm pronouncing it right, the coronavirus family. So the coronavirus family of viruses, as they're classified, they've had these with the swine flu, pig, bat, like whatever, like even AIDS and stuff was affiliated with the monkey. I'm not putting them in terms of corona. I'm just saying that you have this series of questionable origins of situations which, whether they're real or not, are affected in this larger shift of modifications they have to make in medicine and things which all correlate to sort of the emphasis now, which is near Christmas, near the winter solstice, near the Great Conjunction, near the election, near the second wave and all of this, and around the time when there's going to be the Great Conjunction and what they call a solar pulse. And so when there's the emphasis of the corona, this is also an emphasis of the crowning. And so per the affiliation with the coronavirus, it's sort of them sort of like positing their theology in this momentum of sort of making these, sort of extrapolating like through their theology this correlation between converging the micro and the macro, where in the direction of society is supposed to actually be played out in this sort of ritualism, where it's portrayed as a coincidence, but it's a conspiracy, but it's actually realistic, ritualistic.
Okay, so I just want to say something, Azriel, please. Okay, so I've known you for a long time, and I love you. I dearly love you. But what you're doing is a linguistic game, and I can tell you're doing it, right? So what you're doing is you're playing highly complicated linguistic games that 99% of people wouldn't be able to decipher. And so
there's no game.
No, yeah, you think that they won't decipher it, but there is actually some people who do understand what you're doing. And
no, I'm not. Yes, what do you mean doing anything?
Yeah, you are. You are.
What am I? Yeah. What am I doing?
Okay, so I think you're playing linguistic games. That's all I'm gonna say. I think you play linguistic games, and you use a style of thinking, which is this: you are more intellectually superior than most people when it comes to language, and you know that if you spin a more complicated linguistic web than most people can decipher, then they'll never know that you did it, right?
That's kind of an outlandish assumption and motivation, though.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to invalidate anything that you've said, because I think what you said tonight was extremely valuable and extremely worthwhile to consider. 100%.
I don't mind the jabs. Like, this sounds crazy. Just wait till I get into the details of telling you I think that, like, Roman and Greek history aspects of it are completely fake and parodies of older history. But we won't even go into that because that's a.
Let me say this first of all. I do respect you. I want that to be well understood. I respect you to a very high degree. I think you're a linguistically skillful person, and I think you have a advanced understanding of a lot of things, and I respect that. All I'm saying, yeah, I can't even remember what I'm saying. That's how brain damaged I am.
Well, it's a lot to cover, and like I said, like, this would have to be a series because, like, even on time, we're pressed for time. There's so much, man. There's so much, and this is why.
Let's do a series. So here's what I want to say. I think what Azriel has to say is extremely valuable. I've always thought that. And I still think that. And I think we should do a series of podcasts where we get into it step by step, phase by phase. I think we covered a lot tonight. And,
I mean, we don't even, if it's up completely up to you, but we don't even have to have like a limit set on it. Like, we can just go into it for as long as.
Well, that's
I mean,
true,
I can convey the information.
There is some kind of limit for how long the thing can record, and I have to also go to work tomorrow. But yeah.
Oh no. I didn't mean for tonight. I mean for like the episode series in the future. Like, I said I could break it down probably into 3, but I mean it can be like a continuing thing because it's a lot of stuff to talk about.
I think we should do a series. Absolutely, that's a great idea, and I think this is a good place to wrap it up. It might seem somewhat abrupt, but we've covered a lot of ground. And I appreciate your time, my friend. Thank you so much. I know I kind of broke your balls a few times there, but honestly, this is excellent. It always is excellent. I really enjoy your perspective. Same goes for you, Eagle Eyes, aka my good friend Watching Kushner. And you should do another podcast with me because you did one. If you remember, it was called The Book of Enoch with Watching Kushner. So we should do another episode with Eagle Eyes. Because the Moshiach will soon be revealed, and
I would also like to do a continued episode with NSA on our comparative opinions about
honestly,
aliens versus.
I don't think NSA wants to do an episode with you. He doesn't really like you. I do like you.
He can warm up. He can warm up to me. He was being chatty yesterday.
Watching Kushner, but NSA does not like you. Sold out. He does not.
Hey, but he wants to get a story out so we can compare it. I mean, either way, I did want to go into the alien thing does relate to all of this because there is an aspect that where panspermia is involved, where this correlates to pantheism, and it's their scientific realization of pantheism through. That's actually why they have a lot of the Mars probes and stuff coming into play right now. And we have the JAXA coming back with their asteroid stuff. This is all being set up for that.
So here's what I want to say. Soul Diver, aka Azriel. I've always thought you were amazing content, and you're part of what the Roundtable is, right? Like we are this. So I think you should do a series on here, and as long as you want to make a video or whatever, we'll put it out. But let's do it as a series. We'll do how about a 12-part series? Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead and go with to affiliate the name with the official title of the film, or you just want to keep it the Aquarian Blueprint?
Yeah, whatever you want. We can announce
the title is
like the whole thing about the Roundtable is we try to really if someone in our community has a project, we try to really help them out. Advertise it, and it's perfect. You're a good part of the server, and we'll do that. So
I appreciate it, man. Like this is the way to do the podcast. Is just kind of that, like what I call that, like garage feel, where it's just kind of having like.
I mean, we have 3,500 members on the server, and we advertise member content to it. So it's like 3,500 people is the built-in audience, and if you're part of the server, we'll advertise to that community. So it works out really well. And, yeah. It's a beautiful thing.
Well, thanks, man. Actually, I appreciate you setting this up.
We're actually still recording, so we should close this recording now. So, Azriel, thank you so much. So we'll close out the introduction to the Aquarian Blueprint series. And if it was in any way sloppy, I take responsibility for that. I was drunk and high. But nevertheless, it was a good episode. And
It's just an introduction.
Yeah, exactly. Introduction. Thank you so much, Azriel. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We had a really good live audience today and a good audience in the room above. What I will suggest now is that we should join the room above. And Azriel, whenever you want to do the next episode, just let me know. I'd be happy to do so. But that was excellent. Thank you so much. We will get this up on YouTube and BitChute and Podbean and Anchor. Fantastic content. Thank you so much. Good to have you back, Eagle Eyes, watching Kushner. You've been watching me since before I was Shogun, when I was Green Knight, when I was Crusader. The only guy who's been watching me since day one, watching like a hawk with his eagle eyes. Amazing. Okay, I love you so much. All right, okay. Let's continue up to round table 1.